Before we get started, please go over to Amazon.com and grab a copy of my book, Education and Justice. If you have an African-American son in public school, you need this book because I teach you the many ways that public schools mistreat African-American boys and what you can do to help your son. So go over there and get your copy immediately. Black Americans owe Mexico a huge thank you. The country stood with us against slavery when America fought to enslave us. And that history has largely been suppressed by white historians. Because if you look at any U.S. history textbook, you'll read about the Underground Railroad heading north. What you rarely read about is the Underground Railroad that ran south of the border. Again, I believe historians didn't want us to know about the role Mexico played in the abolition of slavery. In a fascinating book titled South to Freedom, Runaway Slaves to Mexico and the Road to the Civil War by Professor Alice Baumgartner, we learned that thousands of enslaved Africans fled the U.S. and found freedom in Mexico. Professor Baumgartner wrote the book about a few years ago. So what I want to do now is read a few passages, okay? So this map here shows you how large Mexico was at one time. You see that line that's coming kind of down from the top, sort of zigzagging all the way down to what looks to be about Louisiana, New Orleans maybe. That at one time was Mexico. And Mexico refused to allow slavery to advance over into that part of continental United States, over that part of North America. So here's the book, South to Freedom. Some of you may have read it already. Others of you should get a copy of this book and read it. This woman is the professor. Again, her name is Alice Baumgartner, okay? And this gentleman is very interesting. He is Mexico's version of Barack Obama, all right? He was a Mexican with African descendancy. So he was part black, which in our country would make him black. And he was a key role in bringing about the end of slavery into Mexico, in Mexico. All right. So let's read. These are excerpts from the book. In the 19th century, newly independent Mexico gained moral power through the rejection of slavery. Now it says newly independent. Let me explain. The Spaniards came from Europe. White people came from Europe, and they colonized what was early Mexico. And with them, they brought slavery based on race. Now, at the time before the Spaniards came, Mexico, like many other countries, they had slaves, but those slaves were not, that slave system was not based on race. So they did not intentionally enslave black people like the Europeans did. The Europeans intentionally enslaved Africans. All right, that early Mexican country or territory, they had slaves, but they did not intentionally enslave Africans. They were enslaved people from all races. All right, so the Spaniards went to Mexico and colonized them, and Mexico was able to gain their independence. All right, with that said, let's read that part again. In the 19th century, newly independent Mexico gained moral power through the rejection of slavery. So it rejected race-based slavery, okay? These policies would alter the lives of enslaved people in Texas and Louisiana and ultimately obstruct the expansion of slavery across the southwestern United States. By showing that we cannot understand the coming of the Civil War without taking into account Mexico and the slaves who reached its soil, This book ultimately contends that American histories of slavery and sectional controversy are, in fact, Mexican histories too. So she's basically saying we can't understand the Civil War and the ending of slavery without understanding Mexico's involvement in bringing about the abolition of slavery in America. The early decades of Mexico's independence were turbulent, and each administration adopted its own policies with respect to slavery, but no administration fully accepted Austin's arguments. Austin being Stephen Austin, who was basically the settler or the founder of Texas, the state of Texas. That's why we have Austin, Texas. That's why the capital is named after him. Mexico's policies, however, numerous and varied, were consistent in one respect. They would not permit slavery to expand unchecked. So they literally resisted white people's attempt to spread slavery all the way across, again, the continental United States. All right, Mexico stopped it. They shed blood to stop it. The 38 members of the recently convened Mexican Congress had a number of reasons to end human bondage. They got 38 members of the recently convened Mexican Congress because she's talking about after they gained their independence. To many Mexicans, colonialism was a kind of slavery. So they saw their colonialism, they saw the Europeans colonizing them as enslaving them. It was one of the reasons why they abhorred slavery so strongly. As a popular political catechism explained, question, what is liberty? Answer, to not be a slave, nor subject to any foreign power. From this perspective, enslavers had no right to own slaves, then European monarchs had to rule over distant colonies. So they're saying the same way the Europeans came here and colonized us, if they don't have the right to do that, then no one has the right to own other people based on their race. That's why this is entitled Black Americans Owe Mexico a Huge Thank You. From this perspective, enslavers had no right to own slaves, then European monarchs had to rule over distant colonies. National independence, in other words, had to be accompanied by personal emancipation. So they said their freedom from Spain had to include the end of slavery, the enslavement of African American people. Champion anti-slavery would also help to distinguish Mexico from Spain, an important task for any fledgling government, but particularly for the Latin American republics. Unlike Great Britain, which grudgingly recognized the independence of the United States after the American Revolution, Spain continued to launch expeditions from Cuba to recover her former colonies and did so until 1830. By abolishing or at least restricting slavery, the Mexican authorities could cast themselves in a different, more enlightened mold than the Spanish government, which continued to permit human bondage across its empire. So we see here that Mexico said no to slavery to distinguish themselves from the Spaniards, the whites, the Europeans, who went about that area in South America and some parts of North America enslaving Africans. But the Mexicans stood up to them on our behalf. In addition, anti-slavery would allow Mexicans to differentiate their independence movement from its more renowned forebear, the American Revolution. So they were trying to also distinguish themselves from America. Although the Latin America republics took inspiration from the independence movement in the United States, Mexican politicians predicted that the North Americanos' glorious uprising would be forgotten because of the contradiction between its professed ideas and the millions of slaves who cultivated the lands of the South with their sweat. So they're saying that the American Revolution would forever be tainted because as white Americans fought for their independence from Britain, they yet were enslavers and had enslaved millions of Africans. So it was a huge contradiction that Mexico said it would not make. It would not fight to free itself from Spain, while at the same time doing as America did by enslaving Africans. Now, again, I just believe we owe Mexico a huge thank you. Mexico, by contrast, had heard the scream of nature against slavery. Nature itself, meaning God. Okay, that this should not be the case. While North Americanos commemorated their independence by wearing cockades and raising liberty poles, anti-slavery Mexicans wanted to celebrate their own emancipation from the yoke of slavery by emancipating African slaves. Wow. And they were just south of the border. And while they had that attitude, and because they had that attitude, it played a huge part in the eventual emancipation of Africans here in North America, here in the United States of America. I mean, this is awesome. This is awesome. So, as you just read, Professor Baumgartner, she argues in the book that Mexico didn't just abolish slavery. Mexico rejected the ideal that a human being could be enslaved because of their race. And that distinction is critical, she writes. It made Mexico a direct threat to the U.S. slave system. Before Mexico became independent in 1821, that was many, many years before slavery ended here in America, Spain, a white European nation, ruled the territory. As you just saw, Spain participated in the transatlantic slave trade, and Africans were enslaved and forced to work in Mexico during the colonial period. But after independence, Mexican leaders saw slavery, as we read, as incompatible with the principles of their new republic. So they followed the path earlier by a Catholic priest by the name of Miguel Hidalgo Castilla. Now, I can't pronounce some of these Spanish names correctly. I'm doing the best I can. But anyway, he was a Catholic priest, and he started the independence movement in 1810, and he issued a decree ending slavery in rebel-held territory. Rebel-held territory meaning the Mexican people rising up against their Spanish colonizers. When the new Mexican nation took shape, leaders debated what kind of society they wanted. I mean, there was a debate, and they made a clear break from the race-based slavery in North America. And so in 1829, President Vicente Guerrero signed a national decree abolishing slavery. And we just showed you the picture of that man, that first black Mexican president. All right, so he abolished slavery. And the decree didn't contain any kind of loopholes. Okay, it didn't make any exceptions for plantation owners or gradual emancipation. It wasn't a gradual thing, what he signed. It made freedom immediate. Not over years, not the children of enslaved people, but it made freedom immediate. And that set Mexico apart from other nations, including the United States of America, where slavery was still a racial caste system, if you will, enforced by law, by the Constitution, right? In Mexico, that system was rejected outright. Guerrero's abolition, it wasn't symbolic. It was enforceable by law. So under Mexico's early law, slavery was totally rejected and repudiated, unlike what happened here in the United States. And so any enslaved person in Mexico, once they set foot on Mexican soil, they were free immediately, regardless of where they came from or who claimed to own them. And that you have to keep in mind too, because remember we had the fugitive slave law here in America, that any black person who escaped slavery could be brought right back into that slave system. So Mexico was different, and its abolition law didn't just free people, it dismantled the legal foundation for race-based slavery altogether. So look at the contrast. The United States slave codes defined blackness as property. If you were black, you were property, chattel slavery. So you were presumed enslaved as a black person in America, and you were presumed to have descended from slaves. But in Mexico, that was completely, totally dismantled and then rejected. And so Mexico never adopted a racial, legal slave code. Freedom in Mexico wasn't determined by one's color, one's race. And that's why black fugitives from Texas and Louisiana and Arkansas and other parts of the Deep South, they saw Mexico as a safe haven. Our people, our ancestors knew, yes, they could go north, okay, and find freedom. But what we don't know, many of us, and have not been taught because it's not in the history books, our ancestors knew that if they could get south, they would also find freedom. They knew once they crossed the Rio Grande, the law recognized their humanity and not their race. So Professor Baumgartner's research shows that Mexico's stance was a deliberate challenge to the United States racial hierarchy. Mexican leaders viewed slavery as a violation, as we read, of nature, of national principles, of equality. I'm just seriously impressed with the nation of Mexico and its enlightened, elevated thinking about humanity, all humanity. So that enabled them to reject the U.S. demands to return fugitives, for example. I mean, imagine that. Enslavers here in America would try to go to Mexico and say, I had some slaves escape from my plantation. They came here, and I want you to give them back to me so that I can take them back and put them in bondage, put them in slavery. Mexico's law rejected that. All right, that was a part of their constitutional law, that there would be no fugitive slave law. In fact, Professor Baumgartner brings out that slave catchers were actually punished in Mexico. Mexico punished them. And that policy, as you can presume, did not sit well with U.S. slaveholders. Texas settlers, many of whom were U.S. citizens who brought enslaved Africans into Mexican territory, they saw Mexico's anti-slavery laws, their anti-slave fugitive laws, as a direct threat to their wealth and power. So in 1835 and 1836, those settlers rebelled against Mexico. And their core grievance was that Mexico's refusal to allow slavery in its territory, again, was a threat to the slave system in America. So Texas declared independence. It declared independence. Its constitution explicitly legalized slavery. So I want you to get a load of that. The state of Texas became a state, all right, because it wanted to retain slavery, unlike their southern neighbor. So this state was literally born out of a desire to enslave Africans. And that was not a coincidence. It was a reaction to Mexico. Texas wanted to protect slavery. Mexico wanted to end it, to abolish it. Again, they saw it, as we read, as an extension of colonialism. And the Spaniards had colonized them. So they figured if we were going to truly get rid of colonization of our people, we must also fight for the freedom of African people. That is big. That is huge. I mean, that's really big. We owe those people. So this conflict over slavery is one of the central and often ignored reasons for the Texas Revolution. Okay? So I want to highlight the fact that Mexicans gave their blood to abolish slavery, fighting the folks who would eventually establish Texas. Once Mexico abolished slavery, fortunately for our ancestors, they could escape slavery in the United States by just simply making it down to Mexico. So there were two routes. Go north, right? The Underground Railroad north, or go south. The Underground Railroad south of the border. We don't hear about it, but it was huge. According to Professor Baumgartner, at least 3,000 to 5,000 enslaved blacks escaped to Mexico from states like Louisiana and Texas. And of course, that number is probably much higher. But they traveled across rivers, through borderlands, and with the help of guides, Mexican guides and sympathetic communities, they found their freedom. Unlike in the United States, Mexico, again, never, and I can't stress this enough, never signed a fugitive slave treaty with the United States. It refused to recognize slaveholders' claims on black flesh, on black bodies. And that made Mexico a genuine sanctuary for black enslaved people fleeing bondage. And U.S. slaveholders were outraged. Okay? And they tried to pressure Mexico, but they couldn't. Mexico pushed back. Mexicans, they fought back physically and in court against slave catchers. I mean, that is really big. All right, they fought for us legally and physically. And yeah, these confrontations, they escalated. They escalated between the United States and Mexico. U.S. politicians, they saw Mexico's anti-slavery stance as a political and economic threat. And it destabilized the United States slave system. And it also destabilized and challenged white Americans' presumed and actual control over black bodies. This tension helped fuel the push for annexation of Texas, and it was a key reason for the Mexican-American War. Slavery was at the center of those events. So let's make the legal contrast clear here. Under U.S. law, if you were black, you were property. And the fugitive slave laws gave white people power to capture you and bring you back or take you back to your enslaver. But under Mexican law, no person could be owned by another person based on race. So race was not a badge of inferiority in Mexico. And so fugitive slave demands were invalidated under Mexican law. All our ancestors had to do was just get down to Mexico. But keep in mind, that was true after and before the Spaniards, the white Europeans, went down and colonized Mexico, because the Spaniards were very much a part of the slave trade. So many married families and single families, black families, they went down to Mexico and they started communities. So you have communities of African Americans that formed in Mexico. I don't know very much about those communities today, but communities like Veracruz, those communities were formed by escaped blacks who came together and formed those communities. And they joined the military to help protect the border. And others of them were farmers and laborers and tradesmen, and so many just stayed in Mexico. Now, some did return after slavery ended, okay? And even when they returned as free people, that their very presence challenged the U.S. slave system, both morally and practically. I mean, it was hard for white Americans to defend slavery when just south of the border, black people were treated like human beings. So those refugees from Mexico, those black refugees who went back to America, they not only challenged the moral foundation of slavery, but they also affected the diplomatic relationship between Mexico and the United States. All right? So despite U.S. pressure, Mexico did not compromise. They did not honor any fugitive slave law from U.S. law, no extradition treaties, no return of black people to bondage. And once again, I just got to say, we owe Mexico a huge thank you. Mexican officials, they understood the humanity of black people. And they saw themselves as also defending their sovereignty and their values. So returning a black fugitive would have meant acknowledging that slavery was legitimate, and they refused to do that. So that was not just their national policy. For them, it was a moral stance, and it had real consequences for us. It undermined the U.S. slave system. Okay? Mexico's rejection of slavery, it didn't end slavery in the U.S., but it definitely exposed slavery as the evil that it was. Okay? So, again, we owe these people a huge debt of gratitude. Huge debt of gratitude. Because it led to the Civil War. It led to the Civil War. By giving black people, our ancestors, a real chance of freedom before emancipation, before the Civil War. Because remember, Mexico rejected slavery in like 1821. That was 45 years or so before America did. So the next time you hear about the Underground Railroad to the north, up to Canada, don't forget the Underground Railroad down south of the border. All right? Those people, because they rejected slavery, they essentially dismantled America's arguments for slavery. And that gave thousands of our ancestors a path to freedom, and it forced the United States to confront its own hypocrisy. Here they got the Declaration of Independence, fought for their freedom while enslaving blacks and considering them chattel under the Constitution. So when we talk about the history of abolishing slavery, we must talk about the role that Mexico played and how it changed lives and shaped policy and helped pave the way toward the ultimate defeat of slavery in North America. And so again, for these reasons that I just outlined, African Americans owe Mexico a huge debt of gratitude. And let me be the first to say, thank you, Mexico. So remember all of this the next time somebody tells you that we ought to be beefing with Mexicans. No, Mexico stood with us in our most vulnerable time. Don't forget that. I am Reverend and Civil Rights Attorney Augustus Corbett. Thank you for watching this video, and as always, stay woke.